This conference will now be recorded.
All
All
right.
right,
Well, thanks
Kristina.
everybody. Thanks, Yana. First of all, thanks for having me back, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm very excited always to talk about policy, and I know that people tend to run out of the room when they hear things like governance or policy. They're like, "Oh no, this is so boring." I'm actually one of those people who gets excited, and I think you should too, because policy really is all about like risk taking, but in a way that keeps you safe and creates opportunities for you. And I know we always talk about that for organizations, but today I want to sort of tilt the tables a little bit, and I want to talk about the policy of one, the policy of you. And it's interesting because the policy of one extends or can extend into the workplace, but it's really important that we actually think about it from our own perspective as well. And so I know that everybody's saying things like, we're living in a new world, it's a new schema out there, but we really aren't living in a new world. The pandemic has made us all work in a different place, but I think we've been coming to this pivot point, at least from the policy of one perspective, for quite some time. Companies and organizations worldwide have always had policy. If you think back to the time that the internet was invented, right? And Tim Berners-Lee really kind of said like, hey, here's the www, here's what we can do. We've had all kinds of really great things happen in the digital space, but also had a lot of pitfalls. And organizations have figured out that in order to avoid them, they've created these policies. Things like we have disaster recovery for our website, so if it goes down, we can quickly come back up. Or, you know, you've got your privacy statements, your security so you're not hacked. And it wasn't really until about the 2007, 2009 timeframe that organizations started to think about the policy of you as a person, but very much limited in the context of the business. So really thinking about it from a social media perspective. How do you protect yourself? But since then, things have really exploded in the digital space. And all of us, including all of us today on this call where it's being recorded, do things in the digital space without necessarily thinking about what is the good, what is the opportunity, and then what are the risks to you personally. And so organizations figured this out a long time ago. And I think this is the most brilliant time for all of us to start thinking about that for ourselves. So, you know, my question for all of you today is, you know, what policies do you have? And do you have policies of one? Because at the end of the day, you know, you are the important one. And so I'm going to be curious. I won't make you show hands because not everybody's on camera, but I'm curious to hear, you know, how many folks really have an active set of policies, not necessarily written down like we do at work, but at home, you know, do you actually have a set of guardrails that keep you safe, that keep your family safe, that protect and shield your career over the next 20, 30 years that you'll be working? Do you have a way to create your own platform, your own brand? And do you have a way to ensure that there's integrity in that? So that as we continue to be not just beings in, you know, the physical space, but also in the digital space, you are seen, viewed, protected, and promulgated and propagated the way that you want to be. And so there's a lot of different things to think about. Today, Anna told me keep it to 20 minutes because we love discussion, and I want to show of hands later and lots of questions. So I'm going to cover really the top areas. I want to talk about security, privacy. I want to talk about social media, things like copyright, but then we can explode it and talk about anything that you want to talk about. And I don't think Jana's told you this in an email or in the intro, but I don't consider any question off bounds. So you can always feel free to ask me anything you want, okay? But let's kind of get in and let's get going. The first thing that I always think about from our individual perspective is security. You know, we heard a little bit in the introduction that folks are working remotely, whether it's at home. Giannis is somewhere in a captain's ship room, as you can see from the imagery around him. I'm also working in my home office, as you can tell. But one of the questions that I always have for everybody is, what security have you put in place for this space around you? And so for a lot of folks, they say, well, what do you mean? You know, I change my password regularly. Okay, well, if you change your password regularly, you're already ahead of most of your peers. But how are you changing your password on a monthly basis? And how are you changing your password for every account in every place, ensuring that you don't have things like the same password for your home laptop as you do for your work laptop? So I think at this point, everyone should be using a tool to actually help them manage that, right? You need to actually help do password encryption, just given how many sites and apps require passwords. The best advice, of course, is to pick unique codes so that each site has its own password, or each app has its own password. But then it's like, oh my gosh, my head's going to explode. So are you also thinking about maybe installing something like a password manager, which actually helps you not just manage those passwords, but ensure that you're regularly updating them? And if there's a data breach or a hack of a site, that you're alerted to change their passwords right away. So that's one thing to be thinking about. But there's also other things to be thinking about, like, are you securing your own network? I actually had my neighbor's network hacked about a month and a half ago, and it's a little bit lost on me, the irony that she works for Ericsson as a systems engineer. So smart woman, systems engineer, works for Ericsson, got hacked. Every device in the house was compromised except for her son's Google Chromebook, because Chromebooks inherently are a little bit less vulnerable. But somebody who wasn't really changing their personal network password, keeping on top of basic hygiene that we ought to be keeping on top of. And so, that's another example of things to be doing. Questions like, are you using two-factor authentication? Giannis, I can see you, so I want to know, are you using two-factor authentication for everything that you have? He's giving us a thumbs up. I think we should challenge him on that. But all of these things really go to the fact of you need to actually be employing, antivirus software regularly. And think about it now that you're sitting at home like I am, right? We have our lovely, work laptops, but then we also have our personal devices. You have double the entry points for a lot of these things, and you have effectively become the system and security administrator for all of that, right? Because you have to keep your own network safe. You also have to protect the environment into which your employer has actually brought their devices. And interestingly enough, even though some of us are coming out of the pandemic slowly, we're going to continue working remotely. And so when we talk about all of these security practices, what I want you to think about is, are you protecting all of your devices, not just your personal device or your work device, but are you protecting all of your devices? And are you protecting them, whether you're sitting in a captain's room, if you're visiting me in my home, if you're working from your home, or maybe you go visit the in-laws, or you come back into the office? All of those environments and all of those devices need to be secure in order to protect, yes, the organization that you work for, but also for you. And this is an interesting point, because somebody asked me the other day, do businesses hold it against employees if they get hacked while working from home during the pandemic? And as a digital policy consultant, that's one of the trends that I've been watching. And so I don't have a good baseline yet in terms of the number of data breaches that have happened to employees. But what I have seen is a lot of insurance companies say, you know what, if you're a business and your employees are working from home and there's a data breach, we are not going to insure your company. And so what I can take from that is that there is going to be more of an onus placed on you as an individual to have security in place and to ensure that you actually get this right. So think about it certainly from a company perspective, but think about it from your personal perspective. What is the liability that you would have beyond just your job, but as an individual? Could you be liable for any kind of a data breach? What does that mean when your partner, your spouse, your parents, your children are working on the same network with devices that are all bringing in the opportunity, not just of some crazy hack, but even such a nuisance like a malware set, perhaps? So security should be top of mind right now if it hasn't been already for you. And then closely behind that should follow privacy. And everybody who's in the EU is probably going, don't give me a lecture on GDPR again. I've got that. Okay, you've got the GDPR down pat, and I'm proud of you. But are you doing some of the basic things you should be doing for your own personal privacy, thinking about the fact that you're going to live a long and prosperous life, and who you are and your private data will be out there for a really long time? Interestingly enough, not only will your data be out there for a really long time, but so will your children's, and probably their children's if you become a grandparent in the next 15 years. And so really from a privacy perspective, you should be thinking about a lot of things. Things like, am I really careful of what's out there? Am I thinking about that? And that can mean really just taking, 15, 20 minutes and worrying about things like data minimization, right? Can you clean up your data and privacy settings on websites used most frequently that don't need to have all of this data out there? Because it's being collected, and in some instances it can be good. Things like, what have I done professionally? It's wonderful. But things like, who is your child? What middle school or high school they went to? Those are oftentimes security and challenge questions that are used by banks to reset passwords. So that type of information floating out there may not be the smartest, and that's the type of privacy you want to protect. Or I even say to people things like, I don't know if you've taken, hopefully you haven't taken part in this challenge of share with the Facebook or Instagram community your high school senior, portrait in support of the class of 2020. Well, what a great way for social engineering folks to get in there and not only be able to reset a lot of your bank passwords, because now they know your high school name and your school mascot, right? But they can actually clean up your checking accounts, not to mention the fact that 2 to 3 years from now, with things like biometric data, people are going to be able to even do more things like manipulate your school records, your work records, et cetera. So the privacy that we're putting in place today is really about not just today, but it's about what's coming at you. And so I want you to be thinking about that. Like, are you limiting the personal information that's out there? And this is a hard one, and I'm going to just share with you briefly how hard this is. Last week, I was working with my son because I homeschool in my free time. I was actually sharing with him what I was working on. So my laptop, his laptop, and his teacher wanted a selfie of him working so that he could show he was doing his work. And he did that. And I thought, oh, how cute. I'm going to share this with my Facebook community. And then in a brief moment, I brought myself back to my policy, which is check yourself for the information you're putting out there into public. And the reason that that's important is because on the back of my son's laptop is his name, his school, his unique school identifying number, as well as the location of the laptop in terms of like which district it belongs to. A lot of personal information I could have easily let flow out of my space, private information that shouldn't be out there, but I gut checked myself and said, whoa, pull back for a moment, not a smart move. So I want all of you to be thinking about things like the information you're putting out there, because it's personal. It reflects on your personal integrity and what can happen to you from a security perspective, but it also reflects on things like your ability to do a job search in the future, which, brings me back to things like, are you using a VPN? Are you doing things like securing your phone? Things like text messaging? Are you using different browsers where you can actually go incognito? I want for all of you to think about the ways that you can protect yourself and to start deliberately thinking. So deliberately, actively thinking, just like your organization does. Think about, how do you want to be seen? What information do you want out there? What is the brand of you? And what is the policy of one, right? That's what I want you all to be thinking about regularly, okay? And so that has a lot to do, obviously, in social media as well. Things like, even though we all like to be on Twitter, we all like to be on Instagram, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But, have you thought about what persona you're putting out there as an individual? And that matters, of course, because of the policy of one, but it also matters in terms of reflecting on your organization that you work for, on the clubs that you're a part of. Perhaps there's a religious organization that you're affiliated with, your network of friends. All of that becomes sort of a whole. And so think carefully about what you're actually cultivating. And in the US, it's interesting because we're seeing a lot of people get very political. I know, true surprise, but a lot of people are getting political. And I don't care where you are on the political realm. The reality is that people see you through that prism at this moment and for years to come. And so as you're thinking about, oh, I should be more active, think about, are you active enough? Should you be active less? What is the right amount? Are you sharing too much information? Like maybe stop yourself before you share your personal information. And maybe the 13th video shot of your cat isn't as important. And there are people who are doing that, by the way, in terms of cats. Just really think through, are you too negative? Are you too positive? How does this balance out? The same thought that you would bring to the digital space for your organization, you need to be bringing to the policy of one, the policy of you, okay? So it's a lot of work, or so it would seem, but if you just take 15 to 20 minutes, a day, or maybe an hour a week, you can actually get yourself shored up in terms of security and privacy and social media. 3 areas that are the most significant right now, probably never more significant at this moment to the individual. And so 3 areas to keep in mind. And then last but not least, what I really want you to think about are things like copyright and protections for yourself. A lot of us are working inside of organizations and coming up with really cool things, whether it's a new way to code an applet, whether it's a new pattern library strategy. Think about what you're contributing to the organization and think about what does that mean, certainly for your growth, for your professional ownership, but also think about that in terms of how you can use that going forward to your career, as well as what are the liabilities of that going forward. And so it can come down to things like making sure that when you're in your private time, you're doing really smart things, right? At work, we would do things like make sure that we don't maybe have inappropriate posters up around us. At home, we make sure that, our underwear isn't behind us when we're getting on a Zoom call. But we also need to make sure that we're actively thinking about things like, if I'm trying to hide what's behind me on a screen during a Zoom call or a Skype call, am I actually violating somebody's copyright by taking a background image and just putting it up there? I've seen so many of those that people just kind of taken off of the internet. And the reality is that a lot of those are copyrighted, and you can't just steal people's information, just like somebody else can't steal that applet that you developed or the interesting code that you innovated around. So really, really be mindful of those types of things. The other thing to think about is, are you going to Google maybe and just Googling an image and using it either for a blog post or sharing it on social media, et cetera? That type of liability and that type of activity not only places you personally at risk, but it could also extend to your organization. And so be really, really smart in terms of what kind of visual imagery are you taking? Do you have copyright ownership? Does it belong to somebody else? And can it come back to haunt you? I had somebody in my network reach out to me and say, what should I do? They actually used a really pretty picture of a beach for their blog post and didn't think about it. They just went out, grabbed it, took it, posted it, and they got a letter, and it was harshly worded, citing a threatening lawsuit. And I don't think that the lawsuit would have actually gone through for that specifically, but it was one of those things where the person just got carried away. They weren't thinking about it. They used an image of a photographer who was smart enough to send them a letter and say, cease and desist. Don't put yourself in that position. Make sure that whenever you're seen from a digital perspective, you have that policy clear, you have that integrity, you know what you stand for, you know what you do, and you're applying all of these things, not just to your corporate time, but also for yourself. Which brings me back to things like, don't copy software code, but make sure that you're also thinking about copywriting software code that you might write or design. Sometimes organizations will let you, or employers will let you take the copyright with you, not necessarily the code. And that's something that you can use to build up your portfolio, make yourself more attractive during a job search, or at least just give yourself a pat on the back and get the kudos for it. So think about, things from several perspectives, both like don't do anything bad, right? Don't create risk for yourself or limit the risk, depending on how comfortable you are with that risk, but then also create the opportunities for yourself, because really that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to build yourself as a brand, as a policy of a person, just like your organization is doing for themselves. And so, you definitely want to make sure that you're keeping your work at all times, clear, clean, Don't keep old files from employers as you're going around. And since we're all home, we don't have soccer practice, we don't have choir practice. This is a good time to take a little bit of time and do some basic hygiene and clean those things up, right? So make sure that you're cleaning things up, making sure that you're being very clear about ownership, patents, et cetera. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is that you're a policy of one, you're an important one, and this is going to keep going with you. So as we're at this point, we're pivoting in time, so to speak. Organizations are doing it, we're personally doing it. We need to make sure that we're adopting the right practices, and hopefully these are some things to get you thinking about that.
Thank you very much, Kristina. Thank you.
Let's do a few. Are you doing
let's
all
do
of these things, Giannis?
Let's do a few questions. I saw Hillary had one. Hillary, would you mind just asking?
Sure. Have to unmute. So when you were talking about, hi, Kristina, nice to see you.
Hi.
I'll turn on my camera. I was eating breakfast. 8 o'clock in the morning in Chicago.
Good to have you here.
So when I saw you talking about heard you talking about the Facebook selfie and those kinds of things, lately I've seen so many people do those avatars, and I know that there's certainly a risk in take the quiz and all of that, because there you are sharing your personal information to some random third party that probably only exists to collect it versus to be an entertainment company. But what about the avatars? Like, they creep me out and they make me uncomfortable. Yeah. But is there that same kind of risk with those?
Yeah, there are. So it's interesting because people go like, oh, why is this being created? You know, why are they even doing this? Is this a cute thing? And it might seem like it's cute and fun, but it's actually the next step in AI. And what you're actually doing is you're starting to self-profile yourself. And so there's algorithms behind it for Facebook that they're going to be using for a lot of the biometric reading, as well as machine learning that's going into the AI. And so we're just in the infant stages of that, right? But they're actually trying to understand how you self-categorize yourself and how others see you compared to the visual imagery and the algorithms that we're laying on top of you as an individual. And so it's really
more creepy. So I don't do the face thing on the phone. I don't do the fingerprint on the phone because, a password is something that I own, but my fingerprint, and I don't care if it goes out, it's a random set of digits. It's not going to harm myself, but my face, my fingerprint, I am not giving those to anybody unless it's the police, because for record keeping or whatever. And I feel like I must be paranoid, but on the other hand, I don't.
No, you're smart. You're smart. And I think the problem here is that you're being very smart and you're being thoughtful. How about this? None of us understand really the extent to which our personal data is being used, manipulated, stored, stolen. We just don't know. That's a reality. So I think what we need to be doing is what you're doing, is just being deliberate and saying, at this moment, given everything else that I know and everything being equal, what is my risk versus what is my opportunity? If I create my avatar, is it going to do something for me beyond giving me 13 seconds of pleasure so I can wave out at my community with my avatar? And the answer is like, probably not. It doesn't enhance my world in any way. So I'm just not going to do it because it's being used for something that I don't know the details of yet. And until I do, I don't want to do it. And that's really important because, not to get on a tangent, in the EU, there's definitely more data protection for folks, but in the US, we've already surpassed crazy levels of data. Facebook, Twitter, any kind of photo imagery of you has already been uploaded into a database and is used in AI algorithms as the basis for federal government to do search for criminals. So they don't own the images. It's actually in the ownership of a private company, so it doesn't put the government in a bad situation, but it's already out there. And if you want to feed the beast, whether...
But yet, we won't do contact tracing either. So we're really two-faced.
Absolutely.
All right.
Oh, no, I think that this is like the issue on the table here. So I don't mean to hog the conversation, but...
No. Sorry, that's not what I meant. Yes, thank you.
It's very valid.
It's a little bit harder to interject myself here, as I think it is when you're meeting in person. So I didn't mean, like, no offense, Hillary. Thank you very much for bringing this on the table.
Hillary and I'll have coffee soon.
Yeah.
And I will make sure to include this in the notes because I'm really happy we covered this. We have 2 more minutes. Let's see. Who's next on the list? Just unmute. Or I'll call on people. Perhaps Martin, are you still there, Martin Frederiksen?
Yes, I am.
You did the book
Hello.
that we covered recently on ethical software
Yes.
design. Here we're seeing it from the perspective of yourselves. What's your take on this, your reflection?
Well, talking about my own Facebook profile, I have actually followed a number of random groups that I have absolutely no interest in. I have
Not
made
confusing the
anything
AI,
I have, for the most private settings, and I've deleted things on Facebook that don't need to be there any longer. And I think one takeaway from Kristina's presentation is really to consider if you want to use a Facebook login or a LinkedIn login or a Twitter login as a shortcut to another account. And Kristina, I have to tell you that I use a password manager. I have the most absurd, long, encrypted passwords, and I never use the Facebook login. I always create a new login based on my email address, and I actually have multiple email addresses because that means that if there's a breach somewhere, I can also trace back what email address was used. And there's actually a trick for some types of mail accounts where you can use a plus sign. Do you know that, Kristina?
Yes. And in fact, that's a good point to share with everybody else on the call if they don't know about it.
Yeah, so you can write
I will
something
add that
and
to the
then
notes. Yeah.
plus your email address, and then you can actually have a single email address, but you can use a unique email address for a sign into a new account. And I would always do that if I was in doubt if this was a secure place to go. And actually, some credit card companies, they allow you to have virtual credit cards. So if you are looking for an online bank, you can actually find online banks where you can create a unique credit card just for one account. So if you get hacked on that account, they only have a virtual copy of a credit card and it's only valid for that website.
Yeah, or use even a proxy, like, use Apple Pay perhaps, or use a proxy if you feel more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all that we did in this time. Thank you once again, Kristina.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Take care. And
Thank you very much. And I will share the slides and the recording, and I'll elaborate a little bit on the issue at the table, as Hillary said. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, everybody who joined us. And thank you, Kristina.
Thanks, Kristina.
Bye-bye.